Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. In today's video, we're going to be discussing Defense Against the Dark Arts. Defense Against the Dark Arts is a core subject taught at Hogwarts that, purportedly, teaches students how to defend themselves against dark magic. More specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the Defense Against the Dark Arts teaching role at Hogwarts and deep diving into each and every professor, ranking them from worst to best. However, I will mention this, I'm only going to be including the main DADA professors during the storyline of the books. There were many professors before the earliest professor on this list, and there will be many after the latest professor on this list. Now, if you're a proper Harry Potter fan, then you'll know that the Defense Against the Dark Arts position is cursed. This is because, years ago, Tom Riddle, Voldemort himself, was denied the role and decided to curse the position. The resulting curse meant that, for as long as the role existed, no professor would be able to hold the position for more than one school year. And Tom was true to his word. After cursing the role, each and every professor had their own unique reason for vacating the role. With such an abundance of different professors in one role, there has certainly been some variety, and today I want to take a look at each of these unique individuals. Which ones were the worst, the best? Which ones actually taught the children something? Without further ado, I present to you every Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher ranked from worst to best. Worst, Amicus Caro. The worst spot on this list goes to Amicus Caro. When the Ministry fell in 1997 and the wizarding world started falling to pieces, he was assigned as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. You probably didn't expect to see him here, particularly as there were some bad professors and presumably Amicus ran a pretty tight ship. However, while Amicus taught a reasonably productive Defense Against the Dark Arts class, primarily due to the threat of his hostile nature, he didn't actually teach any kind of defense, he just taught dark arts. The class just became something else altogether under his tenure, and even though he now taught dark arts, which was one of his specialties, he didn't even do that particularly well. Vincent Krabb, who ends up killing himself with fiendfire, learned the spell from Amicus, and it's certainly his fault that Krabb ended up dying, improperly teaching dark magic to an impressionable young man. Amicus was a particularly cruel teacher and was known to implement torturous punishments in order to discipline students. Neville told the trio that Umbridge's punishments were tame compared to Caro, so I can only imagine what being a student under him would have been like. Dolores Umbridge. Oh boy, where do I start? Dolores Umbridge became a Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at a time when the Ministry began interfering with Hogwarts affairs. Fudge, who vehemently denied that Voldemort had returned, in spite of nearly undeniable evidence, began acting rationally out of, well, fear, and made it his job to make Dumbledore's life difficult, who implored Cornelius to see reason. At this stage, Dolores Umbridge was planted into Hogwarts, and with backing from the Ministry, she quickly stirred things up, eventually moving on to become Hogwarts High Inquisitor and even Headmistress. However, she started as a professor, and right away it became clear that Umbridge had no intention of teaching any sort of standardized curriculum. She had her own plans in mind. With the imminent threat of Lord Voldemort's return, one would have expected that the very course taught to oppose dark magic would have provided more substance. However, Dolores instead taught a useless class full of theory and absolutely no practical application. Those who opposed her were subject to cruel and unusual punishment, hush hush, and she obnoxiously exercised whatever power she had in every instance that she could. Umbridge teaching that year was basically just a waste of the students' time, and she genuinely taught nothing of value, stifling any of the students' attempts to actually try and learn to protect themselves. Queerness Quirrell. Amazingly, despite having Voldemort on the back of his head, Quirrell still made it above Umbridge and the Caros. Here's the thing, Quirrell didn't stifle students' ability to learn or teach them dark magic, but he was basically just a useless, nervous wreck. In his time as professor, he basically taught nothing of value, and I mean, why would he? Voldemort was controlling him the entire time. Furthermore, J.K. Rowling once stated that Quirrell's special ability was that he was learned in the theory of defensive magic, but less adept in the practice. What this tells me is that Quirrell wasn't incompetent or unwise, he was just not a good practitioner of the magic that he taught. In the year 1990, Quirrell took a year-long sabbatical, He told his peers that the sabbatical was an opportunity for him to gain first-hand experience in the field, where in reality, his objective was to find Lord Voldemort, exceedingly curious about what had happened to the Dark Lord who tyrannized the wizarding world for years on end. Voldemort recounts his first meeting with Quirrell. A wizard, young, foolish, and gullible, wandered across my path in the forest I had made my home. Oh, he seemed the very chance I'd been dreaming of, for he was a teacher at Dumbledore's school. He was easy to bend to my will. He brought me back to this country, and after a while, I took possession of his body to supervise him closely as he carried out my orders. I don't think that I could place a wizard controlled by Voldemort much higher on the list, but he was definitely still better than Umbridge and the Caros. Gilderoy Lockhart. Next up, we have the recipient of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, and you know what? I'll let him introduce himself. Me? Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, and 5-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, but I don't talk about that. I didn't get rid of the Bend Banshee by smiling at her. Lockhart was an interesting choice for the role of Defense Against the Dark Arts Professor. You see, to much of the wizarding world, Lockhart was impressive. He had written books about his achievements, conquering all manners of dark creatures, and on paper, he was the perfect person for the role. However, what many didn't know was that he was a big phony. Lockhart was ostentatious, egotistical, and quite frankly, delusional. Lockhart capitalized on the achievements of genuinely powerful witches and wizards by, quite deviously, implementing memory charms that made them forget altogether what they had done. With no one to lay claim to these accomplishments, and no one to refute that it wasn't Lockhart who had achieved them, he claimed them for himself. Of course, Dumbledore knew all along that Lockhart was indeed a fraud, as personally, he knew some of the witches, wizards, that Lockhart had performed memory charms on. However, with no one to fill the role that year, Dumbledore thought, what the heck, and gave the position to Lockhart. Despite being entirely incompetent, Lockhart is reasonably high up on the list because, in Dumbledore's own words, there is plenty to be learned even from a bad teacher. What not to do, how not to be. Alistair Mad-Eye Moody, but really Barty Crouch Jr. 1994 was the year that, once again, a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher took over, famed Death Eater captor Alistair Mad-Eye Moody. Despite his outwardly striking and intimidating appearance, Moody was one of the good guys. He was in the business of capturing dark wizards, and business was booming. The prospect of having Alistair Moody teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts was exciting. I mean, he was an expert after all. But at the same time, there was something odd about Moody. That something was that it wasn't Moody at all. It was Barty Crouch Jr. Strangely, despite the fact that he was a Death Eater impersonating a Hogwarts professor, he still did a much better job than some of the aforementioned names on the list. He was quite bold, and rather uninhibitedly exercised unforgivable forbidden curses in the classroom, like Imperio, Crucio, and Avada Kedavra. But his vast knowledge on the curses actually proved to be quite informative. He didn't directly teach students to perform them, like the Caros, he just taught them what they were and how they worked, but this certainly helped out the trio moving forward. Here's the thing about Barty Crouch Jr. He was a really talented wizard, and though he unfortunately turned over to the dark side, he still had an affinity for learning, and was an exceptional student during his time at Hogwarts. It only makes sense that, even while serving the Death Eaters, he wanted to impart some of his vast knowledge onto the students. I like to imagine that even if Mad-Eye had taught the class himself, that the curriculum would have been quite similar. Severus Snape. In theory, Severus Snape was the perfect Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. He had a profound understanding of both sides of the magical spectrum and knew more about the dark arts than most, making him the perfect candidate to teach students defense. However, at this stage, Snape was still playing double agent, and this is something that we need to consider. He had a lot going on, deceiving one of the darkest and most powerful wizards of all time, and this meant that he was pretty distracted. He also had the old kill Dumbledore to save Malfoy's soul thing going on. He still taught well, and the students certainly got a considerable amount of knowledge from the class, but that doesn't mean he was the best Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. Could he have been? Probably. But was he? No. So with that said, who was? Remus Lupin. In my eyes, Remus Lupin was unquestionably the best Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. He had a vast knowledge of the dark arts and how to defend against them, but he was also an excellent teacher. He knew how to impart his knowledge onto others in a productive way, balancing both theory and practical application. to ensure that, when the time came, his students would be able to implement the magic that he taught. Teachers are people that we're supposed to look up to, not necessarily just from an academic standpoint, but from a moral standpoint as well. Remus Lupin was an excellent role model to his students, a brave, patient, and kind man that knew how to balance education with an element of, well, fun. Most notably, Remus was responsible for teaching Harry the Patronus charm, and this was unquestionably one of the most important things that Harry ever learned from anyone. It came in handy unreasonably often, and without Remus, I'm not sure Harry would have gotten the hang of it so quickly. If Remus had been able to keep his role as Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for more than 1 year, I think that the Battle of Hogwarts would have gone very differently. And that's it for this video. Do you guys agree with my list? Give me your worst to best DADA professor rankings. Until next time, remember, it is the quality of one's convictions that determine success, not the number of followers.